Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Quinn Rosenthal. My normal job during the week is I'm a chaplain at University Hospital here in Columbia. But I don't even know how many times Pastor Rick has asked me to speak and fill in for him here, and I always look forward to it so much. Although this Sunday, I'm not sure if it's such a desirable spot to preach in. Maybe if we looked at the live stream, we'd have fewer views than normal, what with everybody feverishly preparing for what we hope is a legendary Super Bowl this evening. I won't call too much attention to the fact that Pastor Rick took Super Bowl Sunday off. You all can judge whether or not that's just a coincidence. I don't quite know how you native Missourians are feeling today. You may not have already heard me talk about my background, but I grew up in the Chicago suburbs. My Bears actually made the playoffs this year. You may have missed it, but it happened. I've watched the Bears play in the Super Bowl before. I haven't seen them win. I've watched the Blackhawks win 3 Stanley Cups, which I know you all got a taste of last season with the Blues. I've watched the Cubs win the World Series, unlike so many generations of Chicagoans before me. Not to mention I've seen the U.S. women's national soccer team win 2 World Cups. I know what the prospect of a day like this, of a game like this, means. These feelings remind me of a bizarre experience I had a few years ago, and bear with me for something of a long story. I was doing my chaplain residency year at a hospital in downtown Chicago, and I was called in to work with a middle-aged stroke patient. This gentleman was being particularly nasty, not only to the nurses who were caring for him, but perhaps more troublingly, to his wife and daughters who were visiting. The man wasn't particularly nice to me either when I came to visit him, but I had some long conversations with his family about how to process his mental status changes and his increased need for care, as well as the emotional toll that his behavior was taking on them. The patient just discharged to another facility shortly after, and sometime after that, I found out through a member of my congregation at the time, who happened to be a friend of this man's wife, that the man had died. I was invited to his service, his memorial service, at a local VFW hall. The man's daughters spoke first. You could tell that they were having a hard time processing their feelings about losing their father, as their relationship with him had been difficult even prior to his illness. It was clear that he had favored his son over them. This son then took the podium, and what followed was less a eulogy than a rambling, disjointed stream of memories. A fishing trip, a limousine ride, a conversation over beers. In over an hour of what sounded like inane ramblings, there was only one memory that this man's son recounted that caused him to show any real emotion. See if you can guess what it is. It was watching the Cubs win the World Series alongside his father. Of all things, in talking about his father's death, it was talking about that event, that night, that choked him up. I mean, I know it sounds corny, but I remember where I was that night. I remember it was my first anniversary of dating my then girlfriend, now fiance. I remember how it felt. Not just my own feelings either. I mean, it did mean something to me. I had grown up steeped in the culture of the lovable losers, being taught the game and the ways of the fan by my grandfather. The Cubs were a part of my family, and we all suffered through the trauma of the Steve Bartman game and the other disappointing teams of the early 2000s. During my first experience as a chaplain in a summer internship at a small, rundown retirement community in Chicago, I was overwhelmed by death and despair on a daily basis, and I hadn't yet been given the emotional tools at that time in my training to deal with it. Without those 2015 Cubs, I might not have been able to make it through that summer. That was the year they beat the Cardinals in the NLDS, just so we're clear. There's something about a baseball summer and having a game to look forward to almost every day that can keep you going. But my own joy on that night when the Cubs won the World Series came from memories of watching this team play with my family at my grandparents' house, or sometimes even at Wrigley Field, was dwarfed by the outpouring of emotion throughout what seemed like the entire city. Sorry, White Sox fans. Dare I say it, if the Chiefs were to win tonight, it might produce a similar kind of joy. It might even mean more than it did last year. It would be 2 in a row, which hasn't been done many times before. And man, after this year that was, where so many in our community knew so much suffering, lost people, lost livelihoods, lost time, it might just help bring some of our hearts and minds back from the brink of despair, which so many of us have felt during the pandemic. I know that watching the Bears this season gave me something to look forward to every week during the depths of the lockdown. Perhaps this year it just means more. If you're not a sports fan, or perhaps if you just came here to hear my sermon and not my Chicago sports stories, you might think that all this talk about the game is silly, especially compared to something that we all hold so dear and so important as our faith, as worship. And you'd be right. After all, it is just a game. There are so many things in our lives that matter so much more than sports, as much as our media cycles and marketing campaigns that have been built up around professional sports would like you to believe otherwise. In my experience, sports truly do not matter until they do, until they're the only thing you have. I've met so many people in my career as a pastor and a chaplain for whom there's one team that's the only thing they can talk about, with one of their beloved family members who holds diametrically opposed political and social views, for whom one team is the only thing they can be proud of in their community, for whom watching a game is the only thing they have to look forward to in great times of suffering. Nelson Mandela, the first democratically elected president of South Africa, himself said, "Sports have the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire, the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sports can create hope where once there was only despair. It is more powerful than governments in breaking down racial barriers. It laughs in the face of all types of discrimination." Here, Mandela was, of course, primarily speaking about the South African national rugby team, which played a large role in uniting his country, winning the 1995 Rugby World Cup just 1 year after the fall of apartheid. It's never hard to agree with Nelson Mandela, but I think here he touches on the real connection between something like sports and the gospel. When the Cubs won the World Series, if the Chiefs win tonight, you would not be able to contain any of that joy, even if you wanted to. Think about it. If the Chiefs win the Super Bowl, white people will be happy and black people will be happy. Asians and Latinas, gay people and straight people, cis people and trans people, millionaires and homeless people, Republicans and Democrats, racists, neo-Nazis, and all manner of ordinary folks. That is the beauty of what today means. And it's also the beautiful thing about the gospel of Christ. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, which we read this morning, attests to this feeling. Our translation says, "Woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel." Paul says that the gospel is free of charge to all, and that he has taken it upon himself to spread it to all kinds of people. Here we see Paul rejecting out of hand any notion that Jesus' message and the way of Christ should be gated by race, nationality, or social status. At this time, to the people he was writing to, this would have been a radical idea. I mean, Paul should know, right? He came to the early Christian church from a place of extreme intolerance, a Jew who sought to punish other Jews who were not practicing the Orthodox religion of the time. The Roman Empire had thrown many different nations into the same imperial boat, and these nations were almost always divided along religious lines, as long as they were all willing to worship the Roman emperor as a god, or at least pay lip service to the idea. Think about the church that Paul was writing to. This was 30 years after Jesus' life, if that. It's unlikely that the Gospels that we now have in our Bibles had been written yet, and even less likely that they were widely available. Stories and sayings about Jesus were known only in hearsay and oral tradition. The people of the Corinthian church might never have heard the great command of Jesus to make disciples of all nations. To be a member of this early Christian movement meant always to be risking, on some level, persecution and death at the hands of imperial or local authorities. To open up, to spread the word in anything more than a whisper, must have sounded ridiculous to them when this letter was read aloud to their community. And yet Paul says not only that this is what you should do, but that you can't not. It is not a choice as a Christian. Paul says that as a Christ follower, you must be all things to all people. That is to say that the onus is on you to find the common ground on which to build a relationship with someone who is different than you. For the Corinthian church, as well as for us today, this would have been a tremendous ask. To build a tent that includes all of God's people, Jews and Greeks, Ethiopians and Samaritans, must have sounded harder than covering Tyreek Hill or Travis Kelce. To help us with Paul's challenge and charge to these early Corinthians and to bring it home to us in the 21st century, where should we look? If you were one of my youth group kids, you'd know that the answer to this question is always Jesus. Our gospel passage for this morning seems a little boring at first read. This is the very beginning of Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of Mark, which, unlike the other Gospels, gets right into it in chapter 1. There's no Christmas story or preamble, just a few lines about John the Baptist before Jesus becomes a fully fledged rabbi. I guess maybe on first read, I just have Jesus fatigue or pandemic fatigue or something, because we all already know that Jesus routinely healed those who were hopelessly ill and cast out demons without even letting them speak, doesn't make it any less amazing. To me, though, the impact of these stories is an appreciation of the humble beginnings of Jesus' ministry, a ministry that we know as readers will lead him to torture and death. He tried to heal our broken world, literally and figuratively, to drive out the evil powers that rule us, whether they be actual demons or oppression and prejudice. And he died. Of course, that doesn't mean that he lost that fight. It's easy for us to see that there is so much more to it than that. There's more to life, and certainly more to our faith than winning and losing. One of those literary quotes from high school that sticks out most in my head is from To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus Finch tells his daughter Scout, "I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what." If you'd indulge me in one more sports analogy, I promise it's the last one. You may not know this about me, but before I became a minister, before divinity school, I was a right tackle for Division III Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa. I wouldn't trade those years for anything, even though we didn't win many games. We did get licked, a lot, and we had to see it through. Those games that stick out most in my mind were at St. Norbert College, Green Bay, Wisconsin. 8.5 hours on the bus each way. Every game we played there was exactly 30 degrees in a torrential downpour. I remember thinking, is it always this cold and raining, or just when I'm here? Of course, by the fourth quarter, we'd always be down by 50 points, but we'd get the ball back, and I'd have to go back out on the field with the offense. We weren't going to win. All that was going to happen was me getting knocked on my butt again. And yet I buckled my chin strap and went back out there, got lined up, and gave everything I had on every play. I think that experience prepared me better for life than anything I ever learned in a class, more even than learning how to win a game as a team, which did happen from time to time. Friends, we are getting licked. We are losing in this life. My youth pastor always used to say that the entire story of the Bible can be described as we screw up, God forgives. We are mortal, we are fallible, we sin, we give in to temptation. Lately, I feel like my greatest temptation is to keep the gospel all to myself, not to share it or share my life with others, especially those who I don't know or those who are different. But as Paul says, we have to. We have to try. Even though we are licked before we even begin, even though we will fail, because we also know that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Friends, what I most want to say to you this morning is that if your team wins the Super Bowl, appreciate it for what it is. A few moments, a day, or even a week of true, pure joy in the midst of a life that is so short and so hard for so many people. But know that this form of joy is not yours alone. People you love and people you hate will feel that same joy, just as our God causes sunshine and rain to fall on the shoulders of both the righteous and the unrighteous. If we must share this joy with all kinds of people, let us share our faith with all people. Let us also share our love, our compassion, our service, our thirst for justice and mercy and peace. Let us try and fail, but let us know that with God all things are possible. And win or lose, may we never abandon the way of walking humbly alongside our God. Amen.